Hi, my name is Wade Tolles. I'm a brand technical specialist for the IBM Rational Engineering Tools. For the next few minutes, I'm going to be going over some tool basics for new ELM administrators. In our discussion, we'll talk about three general areas. The first of which will be a Jazz Team Server Home, the tabs that are available, the User tab, the Server tab, the Home tab. The next thing we'll talk about is how to create a project. And then finally, we'll go over a few additional topics on administration. So let's go ahead and we'll get started and look at the tools themselves. After you've installed and configured the engineering tools, you'll be taken to the administration home page. Now, some of the things to look at when you're there, when you're newly installed or have recently installed, one of the first things you'll see is a warning in the diagnostics. So if you look at that warning, it's essentially a clock warning. If you have configured multiple servers or a multiple server environment, it is very important that you keep the system clocks current. So in a single server environment, you can go ahead and disable that. If you've got multiple servers, the thing to do is to, first of all, identify your company's NTP server, and then do a search for that NTP in configuration. It's a little bit down from the top, but it's called the NTP server address. And this is where you will enter the NTP server, whether it's your IP address, a DNS name, or whatever. And you'll need to configure that NTP server address on all of the distributed servers. So if you have a requirement server, a testing server, a workflow server, a reporting server, this NTP server address will need to be configured in the advanced properties in each of those. But in terms of a single server, the system clock is not as much of an issue. It can be off by several seconds. It really doesn't matter. So it's safe to go ahead and disable that. Now, if you look at your status summary, you come up with no issues. If you look at your home page, there are no issues in the diagnostics. Now, in your home tab, it's basically a landing page for all of the administrative capabilities. You can manage users from this home page, create them, manage their access, assign licenses, etc. Anything you can do from the tabs at the top of the screen here, you can also do from this primary page. This also allows you to manage the application artifacts for your projects, and we'll talk about that in another session. But these applications are all installed separately but together on this single server. In fact, we'll go ahead and look at that configuration. If you look at your server, you can go into the registered applications and note that each of these applications is independent, but it is completely integrated, and that is with these communications. These are OSLC communications within that registered applications page, and it identifies the consumers as well as the friends for these services. The important, communications tab to be aware of is the consumer or the inbound traffic for the primary Jazz server. Note that your JTS server or your primary server here is the core communication for your ELM tools. So each of these tools communicates through the JTS server. It manages the OSLC communication between the servers. It manages your users, etc. So your JTS is really your primary server. When you are activating the servers or launching the servers, it's important, especially if you've got a if you have a distributed environment, it's important to launch the JTS server first and bring it down last. The server tab has a number of different things. Again, we talked about status, the diagnostics, registered application. You can configure your email in this page. Basically, you'll need the SMTP server that you're going to be using, as well as whatever connection information is required by your environment. The other important thing to be aware of within the server tab is the license key management. A lot of times what I will do is activate the practitioner license management or lifecycle management base license, because that enables the primary JAS tools. So when you have activated, it'll let you know when the expiration date of that activation is. If you are implementing servers, or rather if you are implementing a license that you have purchased, there are a number of ways, obviously, that you can do that. If you have a client access license, you can add an individual license from the client license that is a single user license. If you have floating licenses, you can simply go into the add floating licenses and then access the activation kit that you will have been granted or given access to within the Passport Advantage site. Finally, in your users tab, this is where you would review your active users. You have the ability to review any users that have been archived. You can identify or show the floating licenses that have been acquired by different users. You can manage the licenses in that you can go in and you can select a key that you have access to, or a license key, and then you can apply that to specific users. To add a user, there are a number of ways. If you have an Active Directory, this section is controlled by your Active Directory. In this case, this is managed by the local Liberty server. To create a user in a Liberty server, you would create the user, enter the user's name, and then a user ID. You would then enter their email address. JAS admins, JAS project admins, you can add whatever repository permissions are there. Again, if you are working within an Active Directory, the repository permissions, this section is controlled by the Active Directory groups. You will not be able to modify these groups if you are using an Active Directory. Once your user is configured, and this user will be imported from the Active Directory, you must then assign a license to that user from within the tool. Licenses are not managed from the Active Directory, so you will need an administrator to be able to go in and assign tool licenses to the users who are managed by the Active Directory. Once you've added a license to your new user and you've clicked Save, that user will be created and then will be in the list of users. Note that the user ID is the initial password. So any user you create, you simply let them know that they are, their password is their ID. The next thing we'll talk about for a few minutes is creating a project. And we'll go over this very quickly. Creating a project, there are several ways to create a project area. Certainly one way is from the JTS dashboard near the bottom of the page. You simply click Create Project Area. When you go to the Manage All Project Areas page, you can select from the existing projects. And when you manage a project area, you have access to lots of configurable settings. However, most of those settings will be fine out of the box, at least initially. The areas to practice are the members and administrator areas and the roles and permissions section. So we'll get into that as we go through creating a project. as we noted in the slide there, you can go through on the home page and you can create a lifecycle project, or you can manage lifecycle projects or create a project. One of the things is that if you go in and create a lifecycle project, that means that the project has all of the applications are configured along with the project. So if you create a sandbox project in the lifecycle, it creates a sandbox project in requirements, it creates a sandbox project in test, in workflow, in whichever applications that you have identified within the tool. The other way to create a project is to go into the applications themselves and individually go in and create a project. So if you want to create a requirements management project area, you can do so by creating a project area. That will then bring up the project screen or the requirements screen. And there you will create your active project area. We will create requirements sandbox. And the summary is and then we can put a description in. The second thing is when you are creating a project, you're automatically added as the administrator, whoever creates the project. But the next thing you want to do is add members to the project. So to add members, you can show all, or you can pick individual users by either their names or their IDs. And then once you have done so, you can save that project. And then send an invitation to that user if you have email configured. Now, one thing to note is once you have created a project and added a user, you must also go in and edit their process roles, which means you need to grant them specific capabilities within the tool itself or the application, or they will not be able to use it. Once you've done that and saved that user, remember that you must save for actions like this. The next thing that you can do is review the roles and permissions. So by default, as you saw a second ago in the overview, we added the administrator, author, and configuration lead. If you are the author, you also have commenter rights. That's why I took that out. But note, those roles exist, and with those roles are also associated permissions. So there are, of course, the administrator, author, commenter, and configuration lead. You can add roles, any roles you'd like, but you then must assign appropriate permissions to those roles, and that is can be a fairly complex thing. So if someone is able to do some things and not able to do other things, it is very likely that their role or their permissions for their role does not allow that. So just be aware that the additional roles can be created and combined to provide permissions that are appropriate for each person for what they're doing in their job. Once you have created a project, if you go back and you look at the project dashboard, basically we'll look at the engineering requirements projects, we'll look at all projects, and note that the requirements management sandbox, we now need to apply a project template. So again, as an administrator, I can do that. So we created a basic requirements project, and what we're going to do is we're going to apply a project template. Now, the templates, there are a lot of templates that are available. Some of the more, I guess, traditional requirements template, and then there's the use case requirements template. So note that there's a couple of these templates for traditional and use case. That's because one of these is a sample which contains a specific project. The other is just the basic folders and structure of a use case requirements template. We'll go ahead and use the use case requirements template in this case, and the tool will then go in and apply that template to the project. Now, you can save templates for projects and then use them just like you would save or use these pre-created templates. Note that once you have created the project and once you've applied the template, the recent changes shows you information that has been entered into the tool by the template itself. Now, the other way to create a project, we'll go ahead and look at, if you go back to the administration page, we looked at that very quickly a minute ago. You have the ability to create a lifecycle project from here. The other way to do that is to go to the settings bar, and you can create a lifecycle project from there as well. In this case, you can again say requirements lifecycle. Sandbox. Now, in this case, you have the ability to add other tools. So typically there's the analyst. I mean, you can, if you only have requirements, the requirements license, the analyst template will give you all of the templates that were available for the requirements, the same as you were granted or given in the requirements project. Now, the difference, however, between a lifecycle project and a standard project is that a lifecycle project also will configure the available change management tool for workflow items that are related to workflow items. So we can use our use case requirement template, and all we're doing with our workflow tool is tracking those requirements. So once you've created that or set that up, you can click Save. Note that the other tools, if we go in and say Quality Professional Analyst Developer, for example, that will then also go in and set up the other lifecycle tools. So there are safe templates. Again, we'll go ahead and use our use case requirements template. We'll use our a Scrum template for our change control, and then we'll use a default quality manager tool for our testing tool. When you save a lifecycle project, that will go in and create each of those project areas, and then it will connect those through the OSLC configuration, allowing them to communicate smoothly with each other. If you are not using the workflow tool and you're using a third-party workflow management tool, then you have the ability also to create a lifecycle project here without the CCM component. And you can then use a third-party tool to allow the OSLC configuration between the requirements and testing tool and the third-party tool. That third-party tool will then communicate with the JAS tools just as smoothly and seamlessly as the IBM Engineering Workflow Management tool would. And we'll go ahead and let that finish. Now that the project is created, we can go in and we can see that there are no project members other than the administrator who created the project itself. So the first thing we can do is go in and add members. We chose select or show all last time. Let's go ahead and click a name. Once you've done that, it'll pick whatever is associated with that, and then we'll add and close. And then that username is added to the lifecycle project. To complete that user configuration, you simply go identify the user and then add the appropriate rights or roles to that user for each application. In the case of the CLM or the change management tool, we'll go ahead and add those. I'm just doing all of them because it's easy to do. You may only add one of these roles, or you may add all of them. The first time you add a user, it takes a few seconds for that configuration to show up. But once you've done so, you can go ahead and add those roles, and then you have your first user configured. Now let's go ahead and we'll log out of the Jazz administrator, and we'll log back in as the newly created Wade account. Remember that the ID is initially the password. We're not going to save that. Now, because I'm an administrator, I can also see additional things that the administrator could. But what I'm going to do at this point is go into my personal dashboard, and there you will see that from the primary JTS dashboard, the default screen has a number of help screens, but also it shows me my life cycle projects. It also shows that I'm in the requirements sandbox, which was an individual project. Now, if we look at that sandbox, we will see that the artifacts, there is a configuration, rather a base artifact configuration with templates. There are default artifacts that have been loaded into that basic project from the template. If we return to our dashboard, however, and we look at our lifecycle project, we can then go in and identify the same template was used, and it looks the same. It was just used as part of a template, or rather as a lifecycle project. So the template that's used in an individual project or a lifecycle project is the same. It's just you apply the template at the project creation in the lifecycle, and then you have to go in after you've created the project and apply the template to the project if you do it at an individual project level. Finally, we'll talk about a few other notes on configuration, rather on the administration of the tool. So just briefly, users, projects, artifacts can only be archived. They're not deleted, and that maintains the integrity of the history and the audit trail of the project. So if you've created these users or artifacts specifically and then delete them, they are deleted from the project, and your users can't recover those, but an administrator may have to for an audit reason or an archive purpose. So that maintains the integrity of the project. Jazz admins can create projects and users, but they must have a license to create a project. And that's also important to note. Jazz admins have full access to everything in the application. However, to modify any artifact in a project, the admin must be granted access to the project. The admin can grant himself or herself any required access, but it's very important to understand in an environment which requires very strict control over access, for example, ITAR. Project admins have the access to modify project areas. They can administer roles, permissions, behavior, customizations, team areas, timelines, etc. They can add and remove users to and from the project areas, but they cannot create users or projects. Similarly, anybody who is a user can use anything in the project, but they cannot modify the roles, permissions, anything that require project admin access. The users obviously would not have access to those roles. Users also cannot modify anything in the administration page. So in terms of access, the hierarchical control is admin, project admin, user. Guests can see artifacts if they have a license to see them, but guests cannot, based on the role guest, cannot modify any artifact. So that's it for this session. I hope it was helpful. The next session we'll go over some additional topics related to the engineering requirements management tools.